there, I'm Jane Sawyer, and this is Jane Sawyer Makes Paper Mache in a Less Messy Way. Without a doubt, the most affordable and versatile sculptural medium I can think of is paper mache. It can get a little messy, and unfortunately, this is enough to turn some people off of what is otherwise a truly kick-ass art form. In this video, I'm going to tell you the best paper to use for paper mache, the best recipe for paper mache paste, and the best workflow practices to use so you don't have to put up with this being a messy craft. I have been making statues and sculptures out of paper mache for about 30 years. Like when I was just a little Jane, I probably took out every paper mache book at my public library, and since then I have been obsessed. So after years of experience doing this and just being fed up with having cold, pasty hands, I've figured out a way to do this that gives you both a strong, durable, and smooth paper mache finish, but still doesn't break the bank. Oh, and just to be clear, because paper mache can mean both this and this, we are not going to be touching on the mashed up paper pulp version of paper mache in this here video. Let's go.
Part 1, a less messy workspace.
The key to keeping your mess corralled is to make a corral for your mess. I use these plastic placemats as my primary work surface. They're super easy to clean and they're nice and sturdy. I get these from the dollar store, but I'll leave a link to something similar in my Amazon storefront. Not only do these protect your table, but if you're working with kids, these make a great visual boundary. With kids, if you use a tablecloth, the mess tends to spread right to the boundaries of the table. So I personally like the placemats much better for both myself and with kids. If you're really precious about the table you're working on, you can put some cardboard under the placemat, tape it down with masking tape so it's not sliding around on you, and this will catch any overflow, but it's not waterproof, so I do recommend that placemat on top.
Part 2, paste.
If you did paper mache as a kid, you probably used a paste made of flour and water. And flour and water paste is fine, and it's really accessible, right? Like flour is something that many of us already have in our kitchens. But it can grow mold, attract bugs, and it has a odor. Another disadvantage of flour and water paste is that it's not very tacky until it dries, so you have to get your project really wet to stick the layers of paper together. And wet means sloppy, and sloppy means messy. So I don't mess with flour and water slop at all anymore. I make a mix of 50% white glue and 50% water. Of the readily available brands, Elmer's Glue All is my favorite. Elmer's School Glue is a good second choice, and it's often more affordable than Glue All, but the School Glue has a more watery formula, so mix it at 60% glue and 40% water. I'll leave links to both the Glue All and School Glue in my Amazon storefront, but you might be able to find white glue cheaper at your local hardware store. Any jug of white construction glue will work, and buying it from the hardware store is a great money-saving hack. In addition to being odorless, watered down white glue is slightly tacky while wet, so you don't need to soak your paper to get it to stick. This means a less soggy project, shorter drying times, and most importantly, less drippy mess. It is a bit more expensive than the flour and water paste, and you know, I'm a frugal lady. But if you can afford a jug of white glue, it'll last you a long time, and I think the extra investment is well worth it.
Part 3, the best paper.
Back in the olden days, they used to print out news websites onto some really good paper mache paper. If you can still find newspaper, it works, but it tends to shed ink, making a mess of your hands and the work surface. The less mess alternative is that brown or white stuff used to protect items during shipping. I collect this stuff like my mom used to save plastic bags under the kitchen sink. We just keep a box for that good paper mache paper in our house, and every time we get a parcel, the whole family knows that the good paper goes into the box. If you know anybody who's moved recently or bought dishes, glassware is often wrapped in paper that works super well for paper mache. If you can't scavenge any and you need to buy some, I'll leave a link to some good affordable packing paper in my Amazon storefront.
Part 4, structures.
Okay, you've got your paste, you've got your paper, now we need to make something, right? Paper mache is used to make a smooth, solid surface on top of a form. So what do we use to build a form? Now this video would be far too long if I tried to go over all the different materials and techniques I use, but I do want to touch briefly on some of the common things I use when I'm building my paper mache structures.
Balloons.
Like peas and carrots or peanut butter and jelly, paper mache and balloons are a classic combination. If you want a perfectly round and perfectly symmetrical paper ball, balloons are a great way to achieve that. Consider using a few small balloon balls as building blocks for a sculpture like I did with this Krampus project. If you can find long balloons like for balloon animals, I think those could be a very cool creative opportunity.
Paper balls.
If you hate balloons like I do, the most basic building block that I use for paper mache sculptures is paper balls. You can make them in any size or shape. Essentially, you just crumple up some paper, wrap it in some tape, and cover it in paper mache. You can use paper balls as building blocks and stick them together to make a larger project. You can also cut them apart, pull out the stuffing, and use the pieces. I'll often make a head by cutting a small portion off the bottom of the ball, pulling out the stuffing, and using the lower part to make a bottom jaw. I first saw this technique done by a paper mache artist named Dan Reeder. Dan makes a lot of crazy good sculptures out of just paper mache balls. I will put a link to one of his books in my Amazon storefront. Sometimes my balls might have sticks or wires inside them, but they're still basically just wads of paper. You could use plastic grocery bags too. My province has mostly phased out single-use plastic grocery bags, so it doesn't really make sense for me personally to use these anymore. But if you use plastic grocery bags and you can divert them from the landfill by turning them into some kick-ass art, I think that's a really great thing to do.
Packaging.
Packaging and containers are often great resources for paper mache. You just might have to change the way you look at things. Items we buy are often packed in all kinds of cool shapes you can steal for your sculptures. But think of packaging as having building blocks for larger forms. Here I combined this pointy bit off of an egg carton with a balloon ball to use as this creature's chin.
Found objects.
Found objects also make great forms for paper mache. You'll see lots of examples of this on Pinterest where crafters form paper mache bowls on top of actual bowls. You can do this with other simple shapes too. I did this with a baby doll once. When I wanted to make this paper mache lemon, I just paper macheed on top of an actual lemon. After it was dry, I carefully cut the lemon out of the paper form, made myself a drink, and then reassembled my paper mache halves.
Corrugated cardboard.
Corrugated cardboard is a favorite sculptural building material of mine. It's free, plentiful, and really strong. If you bend it along the corrugations, you can get it to make nice curves. If you want it to stay really flat, cut 2 layers with the corrugations running perpendicular, laminate them together, and you'll end up with a really sturdy structural board that doesn't warp.
Chipboard.
Chipboard is commonly what the crafting community calls the thinner cardboard that is used to make cereal boxes or cracker boxes. Not to be confused with oriented strand board, which some people also call chipboard. This stuff is easy to cut with scissors. It makes a great material for a cut and assemble type form like this dragon. I designed this template to be pasted onto a single cereal box, cut and assembled like a sewing pattern, then covered in paper mache. A shameless plug, you can get the template for free on my website. I will drop a link in the description. So if you're looking for a cardboard that's a bit easier to cut and more flexible than corrugated, chipboard is your answer.
Aluminum foil.
Aluminum foil is another material commonly used by paper mache artists. Johnny from Ultimate Paper Mache uses foil in a lot of her sculptures. Here she is working on a frog. I'll link her channel in the description. I personally use foil pretty sparingly. Firstly, it can be difficult to get strips of paper to stick to foil. Secondly, if you're not putting a clay type product on top, it can be difficult to smooth out the bumps in foil. Also, it's not free, and everything else we've talked about to this point, I can essentially take out of my garbage. However, if you want to make long horns, a long tail, tentacles, or anything long and bendy, aluminum foil is absolutely your best bet.
Foam.
Foam can be another great resource for building paper mache forms. It's a great way to add a lot of volume without a lot of weight. Foam signboards or foam core is a nice alternative to corrugated cardboard and is, at least where I live, pretty easy to find for cheap. It's easier to saw through thicker bits of foam like a foam insulation panel with a bread knife, and thinner slabs of foam can be cut with a craft knife. Disadvantages of foam include it can be a bit messy. In my personal municipality, foam waste goes directly to landfill, whereas there's like waste diversion programs for a lot of the other materials we've talked about today. I know in the US, foam insulation board is pretty affordable, but here in Canada, it's quite pricey. Although, like I said, I can get cheaper foam signboards from the dollar store. So consider these factors if you're thinking about working with foam, but it can have a lot of potential.
Part 5. Preparing your paper.
All right, so after you've built or found your form, you want to prep your paper to get started. The size and shape of your paper strips will depend on the project. In most cases, I like to work with paper patches instead of strips.
For this lemon, I worked with small postage stamp sized pieces of paper. For this dragon, I worked with much larger patches of paper. A good gauge of whether your paper patches are appropriately sized is if you're having a hard time getting your paper to lay flat, you probably need to work with smaller pieces. The one time I do recommend working with long strips of paper is if you're working on something long and skinny like a finger or a tail. You can start at one end and just wrap the strip around like a mummy's bandage. Before you get started, rip up a supply of patches working with a grain of your paper. The paper will rip straight easily in one direction, and not so easily if you rotate it. I rip up a bunch of strips along the grain of my paper and then rip those cross grain into small patches. It's handy to have a few dishes of different sizes of patches ready to go before you get into the glue. Part 6. Applying glue in paper.
Now, I don't mind getting my hands dirty, but I hate having gluey hands. Like, I don't want to work on a project for an hour trying to get into my crafty zen and be sitting there with cold, wet, sloppy hands the whole time. The traditional method of paper mache involves dipping paper strips into flour paste, swiping the excess off with your fingers, and then smoothing it down with your hands. Well, here's how I do it now to avoid getting a sloppy mess all over my hands. The larger brushes from this multi-pack work great. I'll leave a link in my Amazon storefront. I like the nice long bristles. They help to pick up the right amount of glue. I dip the bristles into my glue water mix, put the paper strip down on my placemat, and paint both sides with a thin layer of glue. Then I place the strip onto my form and use the paintbrush to smooth it down. Work your way around the project, making sure everything is smoothed down nice and tightly, and with this method, you can put multiple layers down on top of this one. If you have two colors of packing paper, a good hack is to alternate colors between layers, and this helps you keep track of where you are. I recommend 2 to 3 layers for something where you're going to leave the form inside, or 4 to 6 layers if you're going to cut into the form later. Again, with this method, you don't need to let the piece dry between layers, but if you want to walk away, you can just put a lid on your glue, come back and start another time. Don't leave the paste on your brush though.
Part 7. Cleanup.
Clean your brushes with a bit of dish soap and warm water. If you forget and let the glue dry on the brush, soak in soapy water overnight does the trick. I find the easiest way to clean the placemat is to actually let the glue dry on it. The next day, give it a spray down with a mild all-purpose cleaner. I like method, but anyone will work. And then you can scrape the dried glue clumps off with a gift card.
Part 8. Drying your project.
You'll probably notice that this method of paper mache dries a lot quicker than the old flour and water paste method. You can leave your project in a warm, dry place, rotating it after a few hours so you don't end up with a wet spot on the bottom. However, I dry most of my smaller pieces on top of my forced air HVAC vents. Like this, they usually dry overnight and I don't ever have a wet spot on the bottom. For larger pieces, you can grab a shoe rack or a cookie cooling thingy and set it over the vent so you don't mess up your floor.
And there you have it.
And there you have it, a less messy approach to paper mache. Whether you're a seasoned artist or just trying paper mache for the first time, these tips will help you make strong, quicker drying projects with less mess to clean up. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I respond to almost every comment I get here on my channel, and I'm happy to help out my viewers whenever I can. Give me a like if you found any of the tips in this video helpful. Likes make me feel all warm and fuzzy, and they also allow more people to find this video. Subscribe to my channel if you're interested in more affordable and accessible art info. I post here as often as I can. You can find that template for that dragon I mentioned, as well as lots of other free goodies over at janesawyermakes.com. Check it out, follow me on the socials, go make some less mess paper mache, and I'll see you on the next one.